I still remember the smell of that office, leather, dust, and the faint sweetness of old paper, the kind of room that felt heavier than it looked, as if the walls themselves were aware of the secrets they'd been paid to keep. It was late afternoon, the kind of golden hour that flatters everything except the truth. The city outside glowed like a mirage, glass towers pretending to be eternal. Inside, though, time had stopped. My father's office had always intimidated. The shelves were lined with trophies and ledgers, reminders that success had a smell and a sound, the clink of crystal, the rustle of signed contracts. I used to sit on that dark green sofa as a kid, swinging my legs, watching him dictate letters to his assistant. I thought the world began and ended in that room. But on that day, I didn't feel like a son. I felt like an intruder. The door was already open. That was unusual. My father treated privacy like a currency. I remember hesitating at the threshold, hand on the polished brass handle, wondering if I should knock anyway. But curiosity, that quiet form of rebellion, pulled me inside. His lawyer was there, a grey man in a grey suit with a grey expression. The kind of man who could talk about money while someone bled next to him and never lose his composure. He looked up when I entered, startled, and then looked quickly at my father, as if asking for permission to keep breathing. My father didn't look up. He was studying a set of documents spread across his desk, papers with our family crest printed at the top, the symbol of permanence, legacy, everything he'd ever taught me to worship. I cleared my throat. "You wanted to see me?" He finally looked up. His eyes were calm, too calm. "Yes, sit down." I did. He adjusted his cufflinks before speaking, as if aligning the universe. "You're an adult now," he said. "It's time we talk about responsibility." That word again, responsibility. It always sounded noble until he used it. Then it became a blade disguised as a principle. He gestured to the papers. "These are the revised terms of family trust." I nodded, pretending to understand. I'd heard those words my whole life. Trust fund, succession, heritage. Words that meant stability, continuity, belonging. But when he turned one of the pages toward me, I noticed it instantly. My name wasn't there. I looked again, thinking I'd missed it. The list of beneficiaries was short. My mother, a few distant relatives, and my father's foundation, but not me. Not a single letter of my name. My stomach tightened. "There's a mistake." He didn't blink. "No, there isn't." It took me a moment to realize he wasn't joking. "You removed me?" I asked. "I corrected something," he said calmly. "You're not ready for that responsibility." My pulse started to hammer. The lawyer shifted in his chair, pretending to be invisible. "Not ready," I said. "I've done everything you asked. I studied what you wanted, lived how you wanted. You lived comfortably," he interrupted. "Not purposefully." That was his way of saying you disappointed me. I tried to read his expression. Nothing. Just that familiar calm, the same expression he'd worn when he fired people, when he lied to reporters, when he told me my childhood dog had run away. "This isn't punishment," he said. "It's protection." Protection from what? From yourself. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I looked at the papers again, that small white battle where ink decided who mattered and who didn't. My name had once been printed there. I'd seen it as a boy, proud, thinking it meant I belonged. And now it was gone, erased as neatly as if I'd never existed. I wanted to shout, to accuse him of cruelty, but all I could manage was a whisper. "Why?" He sighed, as though I were a child asking why the sun rises. "Because you don't understand what it means to carry my name. You think it's freedom. It's duty." Duty, another word that had been emptied of all tenderness in our house. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped. "You'll thank me someday," he said, "when you earn your place back." I stood up. "Earn it?" "Yes." His tone was final. "Everything in this family is earned, even forgiveness." I remember the sound my chair made as it scraped the marble floor. That sharp, ugly sound that seemed to cut through his composure for just a second. But even then, he didn't flinch. I walked out without another word. The hallway outside felt longer than I remembered. The portraits of ancestors stared down from the walls, each one framed in gold, each one looking as if they approved of him. I wondered if any of them had erased their sons too. When I stepped outside, the sun was still there, indifferent, bright against the windows of the high-rise. But something inside me had shifted. The city no longer looked like a kingdom. It looked like a stage, and I was no longer part of the script. People think being rich means you can't lose anything. They're wrong. The rich lose differently. They don't lose money. They lose identity. They don't lose homes. They lose belonging. That day, I learned that inheritance isn't a gift. It's a leash. And the moment you stop walking in step with the hand that holds it, you stop existing in the family. We're close to reaching 1,000 subscribers. Help me tell these stories, not because they're mine, but because too many sons have learned too late that legacy can be another word for exile. And tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far these truths travel. When I was a boy, my father used to tell me that trust was the backbone of power. Not affection, not loyalty, just trust. The legal kind, the contractual kind, the kind that lived on paper and decided who mattered. He never said it outright, but I knew the subtext. People can fail you, clauses cannot. I grew up believing the family trust was sacred. It was spoken of the way some families speak about God. My father would describe it over dinner, how every line, every percentage, every signature represented generations of order. He'd tap the table with one manicured finger and say, "This is what separates us from chaos." When I was 10, I asked him what chaos looked like. He smiled and said, "The people who work for us." That was the moment I began to fear the wrong things. He trained me to see life as a ledger, credit and debit, worth and loss. If I did well at school, I earned praise like interest. If I disappointed him, the silence was my debt. By the time I turned 16, I knew the language of business better than that of emotion. I could read a balance sheet, but I couldn't read a face. He used to take me to meetings at the bank. I would sit beside him, a prop in a suit, listening to men discuss numbers so large they stopped meaning anything. I remember one afternoon vividly, the way he introduced me to the board. "My heir," he said. 2 words that wrapped around me like a crown and a choke chain at the same time. For years that word, heir, defined me. I lived for it, terrified of losing it. I measured my worth in his glances, his brief nods of approval, his occasional hand on my shoulder that felt more like ownership than affection. But somewhere along the way, the cracks began to show. I started asking questions about the businesses we owned, the people affected, the donations that weren't as generous as they looked. I asked why the company donated to schools but fired workers for being late. I asked why we built hospitals but underpaid the nurses. He told me, "You think too emotionally. The world doesn't reward feeling." That was the first time I saw disappointment in his eyes. Not because I'd failed, but because I'd cared. Later, in college, I studied philosophy instead of finance. It was my quiet rebellion. Nothing loud, nothing scandalous, just a small act of defiance against the machinery that built me. When he found out, he didn't yell. He simply said, "You're wasting the name I gave you." That sentence haunted me for years. The name he gave me, his name, was both inheritance and prison. Everything I did carried its shadow. He began to test me after that. Small things at first. He'd hand me documents to review, ask if I agreed with his decisions. Every answer I gave seemed wrong. If I agreed, he called me weak. If I disagreed, he called me ungrateful. One evening, I walked into his office unannounced, the same office where my name would later vanish. He was on the phone, his tone clipped, precise. He was talking about me. I remember hearing the words, "He doesn't have the stomach for it." I stood there in the doorway, invisible, listening to my own obituary being written in business terms. After he hung up, I asked him what it meant. He said, "The life you were born for." I told him I didn't ask to be born for anything. He didn't respond. He just stared, the kind of stare that strips you of meaning. That was the last conversation we had before the trust papers changed. Looking back, I think he'd already decided to erase me long before that day. The document was just the final act of a process he'd started years earlier, a slow deletion. Each silence, each withheld compliment, each disappointed sigh was another stroke of the pen. What hurt most wasn't the loss of money. It was the realization that love in our family was conditional, a contract with fine print no one warned me about. My mother knew. She always knew. She'd watch from across the dinner table, her smile soft but weary, her eyes darting between us like someone trying to prevent a fire with water that kept slipping through her fingers. Once, after a particularly tense evening, she came to my room. I was 16. She sat on the edge of my bed and said, "You don't have to be him to survive him." At the time, I didn't understand. I thought she meant patience. I didn't realize she was teaching me how to keep my soul intact. Years later, after she died, I found a letter she'd written, but never sent, addressed to me. It said, "If he ever turns against you, remember that his power ends where your silence ends." I didn't understand that either, not until the day I saw my name missing from the papers. When I left his office that afternoon, I didn't go home. I walked for hours through the city, past the buildings his money had built. Everywhere I looked, I saw his reflection, on glass, in billboards, in the faces of people who feared him more than they respected. The world he made was flawless, but brittle, and somewhere inside it, he'd carved out a space for me, a shape that fit perfectly until I started breathing for myself. Now that space was gone, and I wasn't sure who I was without it. That night, I stood by the river, watching the lights ripple across the water. I took out my phone, stared at his number. For a second, I thought about calling, about apologizing. For what? I didn't know. For existing incorrectly, perhaps. Instead, I put the phone away. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the first flicker of freedom. It didn't feel good, not yet. Freedom never does at the beginning. It just felt honest. Wealth teaches you to fear loss, but sometimes losing what defines you is the only way to find what's real. I didn't go back to my father's house after that meeting. For weeks, I avoided his calls, his assistant's polite messages, the family lawyer's requests for signatures. Every ring felt like a hand reaching through the phone to pull me back into a world that no longer recognized me. I rented a small apartment downtown. It was nothing like the home I grew up in. No marble floors, no echoing hallways, no scent of imported cigars or polished wood. The walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors arguing, laughing, living. It was the first time I'd ever been surrounded by noise that wasn't orchestrated. At night, I'd stare out the window at the skyline, the same skyline that once looked like my inheritance. Now it just looked indifferent. For the first few days, I told myself I was fine, that being cut out of the trust didn't matter, that freedom, even painful, was better than a gilded cage. But it's strange how silence can follow you, how it slips under doors, clings to your thoughts, whispers in your sleep. I started dreaming about the office again, the papers on the desk, my father's calm face, the way my name had vanished, as if erased by something more precise than ink. In those dreams, I'd reach for the documents, but every time I touched them, the paper dissolved into dust. Guilt has a particular flavor, metallic, like blood you can't spit out. It wasn't just about losing the trust. It was about losing the illusion that I had ever truly belonged. Some nights, I'd walk aimlessly through the streets. I'd pass the luxury stores, the doormen, the tinted cars carrying men who looked like my father, and I'd feel this absurd mix of anger and envy. Anger that they ruled the city the way gods ruled myths. Envy that they never seemed to question it. One night, I stopped at a diner. Cheap coffee, cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent, lights that made everyone look tired and human. The waitress smiled at me. A real smile, not one trained by etiquette. She had tired eyes, but they were kind. "You look like you lost something," she said. I laughed. "Everything," she shrugged. "Then you're lucky. Now you can start keeping what's yours." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit me harder than anything my father had ever said. For days after, I thought about what was mine. I realized I didn't know. My life had been curated. Schools, clothes, friends, even opinions. Every choice had been pre-approved by someone. Richer, older, colder. When you're raised in wealth, you learn to mistake obedience for identity. And when obedience is stripped away, you're left staring at a stranger in the mirror. A month later, I got a message from my father's secretary. "He wants to see you. One last time." I almost deleted it. But curiosity, or maybe weakness, won. His office looked exactly the same smell of cedar and control, the same portraits of men who'd built the empire before him. Their painted eyes seemed to follow me as I entered. He was standing by the window, hands behind his back, watching the city, like it belonged to him. "You've lost weight," he said. His voice was casual, as if we were talking about the weather. "You erased me." He turned. "You erased yourself." I laughed, sharp, bitter. "That's convenient." He walked back to his desk, adjusting his cufflink. "You chose to walk away. I gave you everything, education, comfort, opportunity, and you threw it away for your principle." He said the word like it tasted bad. "All I wanted was to be treated like a person," I said. "And what do you think you are now? Some kind of martyr? Do you know how many men would kill to have what you've thrown away?" "Maybe that's the problem," I said quietly. "Maybe too many already have." He stared at me for a long moment. Then, in that same measured tone, he said, "The trust was never just money. It was discipline, legacy, continuity. You were supposed to protect it, not question it." "I'm not a soldier," I said. "You're my son." The words should have sounded like an anchor. Instead, they felt like a chain. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light like something holy. "You'll come back," he said. "They always do. The world out there will remind you what family means." I shook my head. You mistake control for family. He smiled faintly. And you mistake rebellion for strength. We stood there in silence. Two men bound by blood, separated by belief. For a moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or the faint recognition that he'd lost more than a name on a piece of paper. But then it was gone, buried under the same composure that had always protected him. When I turned to leave, he didn't stop me. He just said, "When you're done playing at freedom, you know where to find me." Outside, the air felt colder. The city lights blurred through my tears, though I told myself it was just the wind. That was the last time I saw him alive. 2 years later, he was gone. A heart attack, they said. The kind that comes for men who spend their lives pretending they don't have one. At the funeral, people spoke of his brilliance, his empire, his unshakable discipline. No one mentioned the fear he left behind. No one mentioned the silence. As the priest spoke, I looked at the coffin and thought, this is what absolute control leads to. A box that even he can't open. I didn't cry. I couldn't. There's a kind of grief that feels too heavy for tears. The kind that doesn't come from loss, but from recognition. Recognition that you've spent your whole life trying to earn love from someone who didn't know how to give it. That night, I returned to my small apartment. I poured a drink, sat by the window, and listened to the city hum. Alive, indifferent, free. In the reflection of the glass, I saw his face fade behind mine. For the first time, I didn't look away. I used to believe the story ended when he died. It didn't. It began there, inside the quiet he left behind, inside the questions that no longer had anyone to aim at. For months after the funeral, I avoided the estate lawyer. They kept calling, promising closure, paperwork, final settlement, but I wasn't interested in legal ghosts. What I wanted was meaning, and no signature could give me that. Eventually, curiosity won. I agreed to meet them in the same office where my name had once disappeared. The room felt smaller now, stripped of his gravity. The desk was cleaner, the air lighter. His chair sat empty, turned slightly toward the window, as if he'd left mid-sentence and planned to return. The lawyer opened a folder and pushed a document across the table. This was added shortly before his passing, he said. I looked down. My name was there again. He'd reinstated me, but the words didn't comfort me. They repulsed me. Seeing my name printed there, surrounded by numbers and clauses, felt obscene, like being offered affection, posthumously by a machine that had finally malfunctioned. I slid the paper back. I don't want it, I said. The lawyer blinked. You understand what you're refusing? I do, maybe for the first time. He studied me for a long second, then nodded. Then perhaps he underestimated you. I left before he could say anything. Outside, the city shimmered beneath the afternoon light. For years, I'd seen those towers as monuments to my father's success. That day, they looked like tombstones. I walked without direction until I reached the river, the same place I'd stood the night he erased me. The water was darker now, restless, carrying reflections of a city that never stopped pretending it was eternal. I stood there for a long time, watching the current pull at the light, and I thought about inheritance. How strange it is, the way wealth tries to make permanence out of impermanence. We collect things to protect ourselves from time, and in the end, time collects us instead. I realized then that I'd spent my life chasing a version of my father's approval that never existed. Every achievement had been a performance, every silence a prayer to a God who didn't listen. And now, with the stage empty, I finally heard the faint sound beneath it all, the echo of my own voice, asking who I was without him. The answer came slowly. It began with small things. I sold the last of what tied me to him. The cars, the paintings, the shares. I kept nothing except one photograph, him and me, standing by a lake when I was 7. He's holding my shoulder, smiling not at me, but at the camera. I used to hate that picture. Now it's a reminder of what never was, and that's strangely grounding. I started volunteering at a youth shelter downtown. The first day, someone asked if I'd ever worked, ever before. I said, not really. They laughed, thinking I was joking, but I wasn't. That shelter taught me more about value than all the trust documents combined. There was a boy there, 15, sharp eyes, quiet anger. He reminded me of myself. One evening he asked, "What did your father do?" "Everything," I said, "and nothing that mattered." He nodded, as if he understood. Maybe he did. The months turned into a year. My life grew smaller but clearer. I learned the cost of things, not the price, but the cost. I learned that money makes distance look like safety and silence look like wisdom. I learned that compassion feels nothing like weakness. And every so often, when someone at the shelter spilled coffee or broke a glass, I'd hear my father's voice in the back of my mind. Carelessness is a form of disrespect. But then I'd hear my own voice louder. No, it's a form of being alive. One night, I returned to the river again, a ritual I hadn't planned but couldn't resist. The wind was colder, carrying the scent of rain and exhaust. I pulled the gold watch from my wrist, the last gift he'd given me, and held it above the water. The second hand ticked like a heartbeat. I thought about everything that watch represented, his expectations, his rules, the measured rhythm of a life that had never been mine. Then I let it fall. It sank fast, swallowed by the current. For a moment, I felt nothing. Then I felt everything. Freedom doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, disguised as loss. I walked home through the empty streets, and for the first time, I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel measured. I just felt human, fragile, flawed, and completely unsupervised. Later that night, I recorded this memory. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting, but learning to speak without breaking. People still ask me about my father. They want to know what kind of man he was, what kind of empire he left. I tell them he was brilliant, ruthless, terrified of love, and that his empire still stands. But his legacy doesn't, because legacies built on fear collapse the moment someone stops being afraid. Sometimes, I imagine him listening to these words from wherever he is, shaking his head, muttering that I've learned nothing, but he'd be wrong. I've learned the one thing he never could, that control isn't strength, and forgiveness isn't defeat. Wealth tried to write my story in ink. I'm rewriting it in breath. People think the worst thing a father can do is disown his son. They're wrong. The worst thing a father can do is teach his son to disown himself. I thought losing my place in the trust meant losing my worth. It didn't. It meant finding it. If this story made you think, subscribe, not for me, but for every son who had to lose a fortune to find a voice.